Hi, good morning. So I am, as introduced, I'm Nick Merker with Ice Miller, and we're going to talk today. Stephen Reynolds, Nick Ruse, and I are going to talk today about data breach. I'm going to start us off by talking about some costs associated with data breach. Stephen will get into some litigation items, and Nick will round us out with insurance discussion. I always like to start off a data breach discussion by saying the very simple statement that a data breach is going to happen. There's a lot you can do to mitigate risk in this area. You can implement different policies, procedures, you can audit your environment, you can purchase technology, but the long and short of it is you should plan with the idea that a data breach is going to happen and be prepared in the event that one does happen. So I think this quote is on point in saying that to err is human. These types of things are unavoidable. So to discuss a data breach, we first need to talk about what a data breach is. A data breach really is defined under various statutes, whether it be a state statute, whether it be a federal law like HIPAA or the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act or something along those lines. But for your organization, if you kind of boil it down, a data breach is an unauthorized disclosure of identified or identifiable information. Now that definition really doesn't follow exactly what is in the law, but if you kind of combine everything together, this is the gist of what a data breach is. And what that means is a data breach could be as simple as someone losing a laptop in a cab, someone leaving some paper files on a train, Chinese hackers coming in and taking information out of your environment, or any of those types of common data breach situations that you hear about. But a data breach could also be other items. For example, if you lose, and that's why I have identifiable information in this definition. A data breach could be something where you as an organization give out information into the community that you think is not identifiable that ends up at the end of the day actually being able to identify someone. So you thought you were giving out anonymized information that really wasn't anonymous. And an example that I like to mention here is I think it was in 2002 where Netflix released a bunch of anonymized viewing information. So the idea being that Netflix released this information and said, if you can help us craft an algorithm that tries to predict the next movie that someone's going to watch, we will give the person who creates the best algorithm a prize. And so to do this, they released something like 200,000 anonymized movie listings. So user A watched Pulp Fiction, then they watched Gone Girl, then they watched this, et cetera, et cetera. And they thought it was anonymized. Well, what folks did is they took that information and paired it with publicly available sources like Facebook posts, Rotten Tomatoes comments, and other posts, and they were able to identify individuals based off of that listing. And so, for example, you are the only person who watched this independent film on this day, and you also commented on it on Facebook. And they said that when they made enough connections like that, they could actually identify someone. So in that example, Netflix released information that they thought was not identifiable, but it really was. So I want to note that it's not just the common data breach type vectors you hear about. It can also be your company releasing information. So what happens when a data breach occurs? I want to talk about some costs here. There was a study done recently by the Ponemon Institute in 2014, cost of data breach, and the average cost of a data breach is about $200 per record, and with the average cost being in the sum of $5.9 million. And these costs are broken down in this table here, and I want to focus on some of the costs here individually. So if the biggest cost in a data breach is associated with lost consumer business. Let me mute some. Lost consumer business. So 38% of that $202 per record is associated with lost consumer business. People that are no longer coming into the door anymore because they don't trust your company. And that can be associated with people that actually don't come into the door, like if they're not coming in and shopping at Target. It can be people unsubscribing to your service if you're a cable service provider or some sort of service provider. It could be businesses not willing to work with you anymore because they don't trust you to protect information that you provide to them. Next item I want to focus on is the percentage of the costs associated with legal expense. And the item I want to focus on here is how this cost is rising. If you look in 2007, this was only 6% of data breach costs was associated with legal services and defense. And that has grown exponentially over the years to now in 2014 to be 16% of the cost. What you're not really seeing in this graph is that the cost of a data breach from 2007 to 2014 also is increasing. So the percentage of legal services spent in defense is increasing by a very fast rate, and also the cost of a data breach is increasing as well. So this cost increase from 2007 to 2015 is more than just a 10% increase over the years. In raw dollars, it is a very, very high amount of cost increase in these last 7 years. And that is associated, as Stephen will talk about, with class action, defense litigation, and other types of litigation that comes out in data breach. The other item I want to focus on is on the increasing costs of investigation and forensics. One of the third highest percent cost associated that the Poneman Institute found is associated with investigations and forensics. If a data breach occurs, if you don't identify that yourself that the data breach occurs, you have to go in and figure out what happened, figure out what information is lost, figure out where the exploit is occurring, and patch it yourself. If you even if you figure out that the data breach is occurring, you are seeing information leave your environment. It's a massive forensic effort of you trying to figure out what information was lost. We had a situation where a client had an email account that was compromised, and the email went back 5 or 6 years, and we had to go in and evaluate the entirety of that email account to figure out what information could have been obtained by that unauthorized third party. And you can imagine just reviewing 5 or 6 years of email is a very, very big task, many hours in line there with just one email account. Just imagine if there were hundreds of email accounts compromised, hundreds of thousands of documents and the like. And then I also want to show the short-term effects of data breach associated with stock price in this graph. And you could show this graph with the Target breach as well, with the Home Depot breach as well, with any of the breaches that have happened over the last couple years. But I think this Apple one is the quickest reaction from the community. Now, the Apple breach, this is associated with the iCloud situation where some celebrities lost some very sensitive photos as a result of phishing attacks against their secret question and answer. I don't believe this was at least there's not any public information to say this was any sort of technical issue with Apple as much as it was secret question and answers being compromised. But you can see when after that was announced, the immediate reaction to Apple's stock price is a drop there from about $103 to $99, and that happened almost immediately. Now, Apple has since obviously recovered. I mean, the iPhone 6 was released, and their stock price is much higher than it was in this example, but that September 3rd just knee-jerk reaction to stock price can also be seen as an effect of data breach as well. And going back to Target, remember how I said before that 38% of data breach costs are associated with lost consumer goodwill, consumers no longer coming into the door anymore. Target has an example of this. They said that they had a customer turnover of about 3.2%. They had 3.2% less sales due to probably partly because of market effects, but they believe partly probably because of the data breach situation. And now Stephen Reynolds is going to talk about data breach and how it relates to litigation.
Hello, everyone, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, and thank you all for hanging around. I'm going to talk about the litigation that can come from the data breach. You'll recall from Nick's slide that was the second largest cost after the lost customer business is the cost in litigation. So there's multiple types of litigation that can result from a data breach. The first one being consumer class actions, next being shareholder lawsuits, third we have listed individual claims, fourth state attorney general investigations and lawsuits, and those are claims that can be brought.
As a reminder, please make sure to mute your lines. Thank you.
And those are claims that can be brought by various state attorney generals. It can be brought by the state attorney general of the state your business is in, or an attorney general of the state where your customers are located. Then there's federal government enforcement actions. Those are your actions from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, or the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And then lastly being business versus business lawsuits. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these types of litigation. The first one is the consumer class actions. These are the ones you usually see in the headlines. These now get filed within really hours of a major data breach being announced. Some of you may recall the Anthem breach. There were lawsuits filed the very next day after they made their announcements. So you see these are consumer class action claims brought against the companies that had the data breach. While these lawsuits, the consumer class actions, may be the most likely ones to come from a data breach, these have largely been unsuccessful as they make their way through the courts. And that's because of a United States Supreme Court ruling back in 2013, which involved when plaintiffs or when litigants have standing to sue in federal court. And the Supreme Court there, in this case, found litigants have to meet a higher threshold to show an injury in fact than just saying there's a remote possibility that they may have some injury in the future because of an event. And because of that decision and other court cases interpreting it, a lot of these consumer class actions do ultimately end up getting dismissed. But even though they do get dismissed frequently, that does not stop them from getting filed. They actually are getting filed more often now with more and more data breaches occurring. And despite them being a lot of times being dismissed eventually, they do result in litigation costs. The next category we talk about are the shareholder lawsuits. And these are lawsuits, again, brought on behalf of individuals. Here not brought on behalf of the consumers who are affected, but people who own stock in the companies that had the data breach. For example, we saw shareholder lawsuits get filed by people who own stock in Target and Home Depot. There was a 2011 guidance from the Securities and Exchange Commission that specifically talked about data breaches. And the SEC, even more recently, has made this a point to communicate to companies the importance of keeping shareholders informed as to data breaches and the company's security posture. Another result from data breaches can be just individual lawsuits. This can be a lawsuit brought on behalf of just a single consumer harmed by the data breach. I'm showing an example of a verdict form from a lawsuit that happened right in Indiana, in Indianapolis. This was a lawsuit against Walgreens based on a pharmacist's unauthorized disclosure of personally identifiable information about a consumer. The jury awarded $1.8 million against the defendants, finding Walgreens and its employee were 80% responsible for this breach. This case has been up on appeal with the Indiana Court of Appeals and affirmed, and I believe it's currently pending transfer to the Indiana Supreme Court. This is a real result of a data breach and just an individual lawsuit by one consumer. Next category is the State Attorney General investigations. Here in Indiana, our Attorney General, Greg Zeller, has publicly stated that his office is committed to enforcing Indiana's data breach law to better protect our consumers. And several other state attorney generals are really taking the lead in enforcing data privacy laws, especially with there not being a general federal standard that applies to all companies. The next type of litigation to result from the data breach would be your federal government enforcement actions. The real leader in bringing these is the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC in 2000, I think this was in 2013, but their 2014 report stated they brought over 130 spam and spyware cases and more than 40 general privacy lawsuits. Really, the FTC, when we go to conferences and we hear from people in the FTC, what they make a point of saying is that they're looking for companies that make promises regarding how they're going to use consumer data to hold on to and adhere to those promises. And they look for companies to collect data in a way that isn't a way a consumer wouldn't expect. One example they give is an app maker that was just a flashlight app for mobile phones, but the app was actually collecting geolocation data that the company was then selling. The FTC find that company, really to make an example out of, they are looking for companies who are collecting information in ways consumers do not expect, and they are imposing penalties against those companies. Though the FTC has really been the lead, other federal government agencies are also getting involved. The FCC is also issuing fines against companies for breaching consumer privacy obligations. And as we discussed, the SEC is also entering this arena. The last category of data breach lawsuits are the business versus business lawsuits. Now, these are becoming more prevalent. One example would be following the Target breach, there were banks that sued Target as well, saying they incurred costs in having to replace the consumer's credit cards. According to some sources, they say this cost them on average about $12 per credit card to replace, including their cost of mailing, increased call volume, and dealing with people who are calling their credit card companies saying, my identity's been stolen, what are you going to do about this Target breach? So these are lawsuits that can also result from a data breach, including if you're a vendor or you have contracts with suppliers, you may hold data that belongs to other people, and you may get lawsuits from those other companies as well. And now to talk about other ways businesses can protect themselves, we can turn back to Nick.
So what do we do? What can we do? The first thing is to go back to what I said before, and that is to assume that a data breach is going to happen, accept that a data breach is going to happen eventually to your company. And you need to have a plan. And in reality, what you want to have is a playbook, some combination of a policy, maybe a procedure, but some document that when a data breach happens, you can get the right people to get in the right room and slap that document down on the table, and everyone knows what needs to be done in order to contain the data breach, get out in front of the public, and figure out what is the best way to move the company forward with this incident that's happened. And there are some things that you would want to consider in a playbook. You want to have an incident team that is comprised of engineers, managers, some public relations folks, legal, and others in your company. You want to know what an incident is, define categories of an incident, whether it's a low, medium, high risk incident, whether you need to bring in a public relations folks, or even tell the public at all. You want to have that all spelled out in your plan so there's really no decisions that need to be made on those types of critical issues, and you can really look to the plan to understand what you want to do for the company. And I think the most important thing to have in an incident response plan is some sort of communication lines that are already established both internally for your organization, whether that be an incident team has a standing conference bridge that you could all join at the same time, and that's within the plan. But it could also be external communication lines, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide here. External communication lines being those communication lines to your public relations firm. Maybe you have a PR firm on retainer, or at least a contact person that you can dial up immediately when a data breach occurs and get the right face in the public about your breach immediately. There's also law enforcement. You want to have good relationships with your local FBI agent that you can call and describe what's happened to you and get their advice on whether they should come in and assist you right now or at some other time. Also, internet service providers. If you need to call them and immediately shut off access to some foreign country where a data breach is happening, where information is going, you can do that with your internet service provider as well. Also, a forensics team. And also with legal counsel. If you don't have some sort of data breach coach or some sort of legal counsel that you can call and know that they can help you out, I would recommend forming that relationship with someone. If you have an attorney that you just use for all the matters in your company, that may not be the right attorney that you want to use for a data breach situation, and you may want to build that relationship today so you're not slow in responding when a data breach actually occurs. And so why do we need a plan? Well, go back to that slide I had on before with the table where the percent costs associated with data breach. Remember how it said that 38% is associated with lost consumer goodwill, consumers no longer working with your company because of the data breach. That cost is exacerbated if you are slow in responding to the data breach. If you're perceived publicly as not wearing the white hat, not doing the best thing that you could possibly do to contain and rectify the issue, you will get slammed in the media and you'll have increased exposure associated with that lost consumer goodwill. And the best example that I have for this is the PlayStation Network compromise that happened back in 2011. And this quote is from a congressional hearing with Sony. And if a congressional hearing has a quote that starts off with, "I hate to pile on, but," then you're not having a good day in front of Congress. So this is something you want to avoid. And the long and short of this quote is that Sony didn't say anything for 7 days. The PlayStation Network was down, and Sony didn't make a public statement for 7 days. And the public just slammed them when they finally came out and did say something. So you want to make sure that you learn from the mistakes or the issues that others have experienced, and timeliness is clearly a very important thing to consider. So what else can we do? I'm just going to go through this really quickly for sake of time, but what else we can do? You want to build a privacy program and an information security program for your organization, and an information security program that actually assesses and mitigates risk for your company. If you're one of those companies that has some sort of PCI DSS compliance and you feel like that will be your end-all, be-all information security program, there would be some that would argue that you're employing what's called checkbox security, where you are building some information security program solely to be compliant with some set of standards, and you're not really assessing and mitigating the risk for your organization appropriately. So an information security program may not be completely related to a compliance program, and an information security program that really has folks sitting down and assessing risk to the organization and figuring out how you're going to mitigate risk where you would like to is something that your organization should consider doing. And then also having a privacy program, kind of a newer concept. Everyone on your website has a privacy statement, but having a privacy program for your organization where you discuss maybe implementing privacy by design, conducting privacy impact assessments to make sure you're conforming with your privacy policy, performing a privacy risk analysis, which is a little different than an information security risk assessment, and also part of your privacy program considering vendor management. What information are you giving to third parties? What information are you trusting with your third parties? And how are you making sure that they're using that information, destroying that information appropriately? Because if the end of the day, if your company is giving information to a third party and that third party has a data breach, your consumers are going to hold you accountable. They're not going to hold your third party accountable. They may hold them accountable as well, but you're definitely going to be held accountable by your consumers if one of your third parties has a data breach. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Roos, who's going to talk through some insurance.
How is everyone? The slide at the beginning of the presentation, you notice next to Nick Merker's name and Steven's name, there was a bunch of little letters. They're both privacy professionals. I am not a privacy professional. I'm an insurance lawyer. Basically, I try and wring as much coverage out of as many policies as I can find when a client has a claim, when a client has an event. And as part of that job, I spend a lot of time trying to convince people to talk with us before they have a loss, to do pre-loss counseling, to think about insurance, to read their insurance policies. So when Stephen and Nick asked me to add some remarks here today, the first question that came to mind is, why should the people on this call, on this webinar, care about this particular type of insurance? And I think Nick touched on the answer earlier, and it's pretty simple. Data breaches and network security events are going to happen. No matter how much you follow the advice that Nick gives you, no matter how much you follow the advice you're going to hear from Brian later on, no matter what you do, these events are going to happen. This is not a 100-year storm. This is happening every day. Somebody smarter than me said, there are two types of companies. Companies that have had a data breach and know about it, and companies that have had a data breach and just haven't found out yet. So these events are going to happen, and they're going to be expensive. And for some companies, it's going to happen. It's going to cost $50,000. And for some companies, an event's going to happen, and it's going to cost $1 million. And for some companies, an event's going to happen, and it's going to cost nothing because it was a fully insured event. Another way to think of this is, insurance has this terribly meaningful role in dictating what the practical implications of one of these events are, or what the bottom line impact is. I tell clients all the time, you would rather have a $2 million loss that's entirely covered by insurance than have a $200,000 loss that isn't. And so because insurance can play such a meaningful role in what that out-of-pocket cost is, what that real-world impact is, Insurance has to be part of the risk management process. It has to be part of the risk assessment process, the best practices formulation. It has to be part of the calculus when you start talking about cybersecurity, when you start talking about network security. And kind of to underscore this, I think Stephen touched on this earlier. The SEC issued some guidance about what they would like companies to disclose with respect to cyber risks. And it's notable, they've got 5 bullet points. So in the context of cyber risk, the SEC is sitting there and objectively saying, among the 5 most important things an investor should know, number 5 is a description of relevant insurance coverage. In other words, even the SEC is sitting here saying, this has to be part of the risk assessment process. So how does that bring us back to the folks on this call? Well, my expectation that probably if you're participating in this webinar, you're probably involved at least in some capacity in insurance procurement. And let me tell you how a lot of businesses, procure insurance. They sit down with their broker once a year. The broker comes in with hundreds of pages of documents. They ask a couple questions. It's hey, we had this event last year. They kind of insure the last loss rather than the prospective loss. And then they look at the sheet on the front that's got all the different coverages and all the different prices. And a lot of companies, they sit there and they pick the second or third cheapest one. They don't totally understand the difference. They don't feel like they should buy the cheapest one, so they go up the list a little bit. You may think I'm exaggerating, but honestly, sometimes that's the level of analysis that goes in. And when do they figure out that they bought the wrong insurance? That's when they have an event and they send us the 600 pages of documents and say, hey, is this covered? Obviously, sometimes it's too late there at that point. Kind of underscoring, the lack of attention that happens sometimes with respect to insurance. A lot of times I have a client with a claim and I ask them, can you send me your insurance policies? Let's look at this. Let's see your coverages. And they have a trouble assembling their policy. They'll have the declarations page that says, these are the types of coverages you bought, but they don't even have the policies that go behind the declaration pages, the documents that set forth the scopes of coverages. And so, those are the documents that dictate what coverages you have and you haven't. And a lot of clients don't even know, where to find them when they need them. Now, I suppose I would concede that if you're sitting in this room, you're not totally foregoing coverage for cyber risks. But I will say that, there's this disconnect often between the people that are making decisions about cyber insurance and the people that understand the company's risks. And that's really the important point. Purchasing cyber insurance should not be a check-the-box exercise. If you're just checking the box and saying, hey, we need this, and buying it, that's going to fall short 9 times out of 10. Insurance has to be part of your risk management process, and it has to be a meaningful part. But in order to make it meaningful, you have to have somebody involved in the process that understands both the insurance and the company's individual risks. So let's talk for a few minutes about what you need to know about this insurance. Like most discussions about insurance, it starts with the difference between first-party and third-party claims. I think most people probably in this room know the difference, but just to hit the high points, a first-party claim is a claim that's paid directly to you. It's a claim for property damage under your homeowner's policy. You, the insured, have had a loss and you want the insurer to reimburse you for that loss. In the data breach context, first-party coverage is going to be the cost that you incur investigating a breach, the costs you incur in sending out notification, some cases maybe some lost business income. Third-party claims, those are claims that involve damage or harm to some third party, somebody other than you. So this is a liability claim. This is the liability coverage on your insurance. You hurt somebody, you damaged somebody's car, they're coming after you. In the data breach context, that's talking about the cost of defending a lawsuit or defending a regulatory action and the judgments or settlements that kind of flow from that. Now, historically, coverage for first-party losses is almost always found under a property policy. I won't spend too much time talking about this, but there's two kinds of property policies. There's property policies that enumerate risks, and there's property policies that cover all risks. I can tell you, under the property policies that enumerate risks, a standard property policy, a data breach or a network security event is rarely, if ever, going to be included. Even in the case of an all-risk policy, there's always this requirement under the property policy that there be some kind of property damage, that there be some kind of injury, this physical loss or damage. That's been batted back and forth in the courts as to whether a data breach, kind of gets there. And I will tell you, the insurers have won the last 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 rounds. And to be honest with you, even to just end the dispute, they've started including language in most property policies that clarify this issue because it's become such a big deal and such a big part of litigation. You will find, sometimes a sublimit in your property policy that's providing some de minimis coverage for data breach, but you're probably looking at $5-10 grand of coverage there. Third-party losses under traditional policies. This is your CGL policy. Again, I could speak for a while about the arguments that have been made for and against trying to find data breach coverage under CGL policies, but that entire dialogue has been short-circuited. About 14 months ago, the ISO, which is the organization that issues and writes the standard insurance policies, they issued a new mandatory form, and basically every company that's issuing a standard commercial general liability policy now has a provision that unequivocally precludes coverage for claims arising from data breaches. So if we have no coverage under our traditional third-party CGL policy, and we have no coverage under our traditional first-party property policy, where does that leave us? And the answer is specialty insurance. You'll hear it called cyber insurance, you'll hear it called tech insurance, network security, just basically anything that sounds kind of modern and futuristic. These coverages will often be sold in what's called a modular format, meaning it's one component of a larger coverage. And if you can see the graphic there, it's honestly what it looks like a lot of times. There's a bunch of choices to make. It's, hey, we offer each of these coverages under the cybersecurity package. You choose which of the modular coverages you want to include. That being said, the ISO, which I mentioned earlier, they've created a standard form for this type of coverage. It's called the Internet Liability and Network Protection Policy. But for whatever reason, the insurers have basically rejected it. It's proven very unpopular, and so these are not uniform policies. Instead, they're individual policies providing wide ranges of coverage under wide ranges of language. So where that leaves you is, although this coverage is incredibly important and incredibly valuable, choosing the right technology, data breach, cyber insurance is a real problem. It's a really difficult thing to do. For starters, there's kind of this dizzying array of cyber products in the marketplace. Each one's got its own terms, each one's got its own conditions, and they vary really dramatically from insurer to insurer. Even from policy to policy underwritten by the same insurer. If you go to AIG's network security insurance page right now, you'll see they sell 4 products that it's hard to tell the difference between AIG product 1 and AIG product 2. These policies can also be tricky in that they collapse these ideas of first-party and third-party coverage into a single policy. Then you add on top of that the idea that kind of the range of e-commerce that people and companies are engaged in is all over the map. So more than is the case with just about any other type of insurance, the successful negotiation, the successful placement of cyber coverage requires this identification and consideration of your company's specific risks, your risk profile, your risk tolerance, knowledge of what the available coverages are in the marketplace, and really careful attention to what the specific policy language says. Another way to think about this is this insurance market is not mature. I mentioned ISO earlier. You could come and ask me about a loss under a CGL policy, and I don't even need to see your CGL policy. I know exactly what it says. They're all the same. That couldn't be further from the truth in the context of tech and cyber policies. These things are very, and some have huge gaps where you're buying insurance for one purpose and it's not providing the coverage you want, and others have coverages that weren't even intended. You're paying a premium for a product and you're getting more than you think. So it's just so critical to read these policies, to find out what they say, to find out what you're buying. So I'll go through this kind of checklist real quick, and I think these are the high points, and I'll try to do it quickly because I know we're pressed for time. But what are you looking for when you're procuring a data breach policy? So the first thing on there is the types of data included. Certain things are always going to be included. So-called PII, personally identifiable information, it's always going to be included in the policy. But it can also include confidential corporate data. It can even include non-electronic data like paper records. There was a case out in Massachusetts where a Massachusetts General Hospital employee left a bunch of files on the train. The hospital paid $1 million fine to the Massachusetts Department of Health and Human Services. That $1 million fine was covered by their cyber insurance. There was no computer involved. There was no network involved. There was just a really favorable definition of the word data. So again, it's read the policy, see what it says, find the most expansive coverage. Second thing on the list is forensic investigation costs. I won't belay this point, but this is oftentimes the most complicated and the most expensive part. You have these events, you have very short timelines, you have to put feet on the ground on day one. A lot of times, you're doing an investigation to figure out the scope, to figure out if there was in fact even a data breach. You're hiring computer forensics people, you're hiring lawyers. This can be very expensive, oftentimes more expensive than the actual notification or the lawsuits that follow. So make sure you have investigation costs coverage. As a corollary to that, you also want coverage for potential but unconfirmed breaches. If you can do an investigation that determines at the end that there was no reportable breach, that is great for your business. But you don't want a requirement that the breach be reportable before your insurance coverage is triggered. It puts you in this weird situation of having to report to have coverage, and you don't want to be in that box. You want the broader coverage that's going to step in when you have even a potential breach. Data in the hands of third parties. More and more people are trusting their data to the third parties. You want a policy that speaks in terms of data that you're responsible for, not data in your possession. Insurers, sometimes it makes them nervous because they can't underwrite your vendors, but this is critical and it's available pretty universally. You just have to ask for it. Regulatory coverage, again, going back to that Massachusetts General case, $1 million fine, paid by insurance. You want that regulatory coverage. Some fines are not insurable, but the defense costs of negotiating and responding to a regulatory body are always insurable. So regulatory coverage. Business interruption, I think this is self-explanatory, but keep in mind sometimes, it takes several days for the forensics to be done, and sometimes you have to go offline. And so if you're having to make accommodations to keep your business running, or you're losing money or customers in the interim, it's really nice to have that support of your insurer to make up that gap. Just a couple more here. What I call the remediation coverages, and this is the crisis management. This is the credit monitoring that you can offer to your customers. This is the public relations expense. This is the stuff that's kind of the fringe benefits. This is what helps you go to sleep at night when you're having one of these events. Ask for it, get it in your policy. It's typically not that expensive, but it helps you kind of have that team at the ready that Nick was talking about, and it helps you from, frankly, getting cheap in the aftermath of the data breach and saying, you know what, we don't need to hire a PR firm. If you got coverage for it, you're not going to hesitate. You're going to get somebody out there working on your communications. Second to last here, limits and control. Some policies speak in terms of dollars. They say we'll give you $1 million in coverage. Others speak in terms of the number of files or number of customers who've had their data exposed. A lot of times you can get a lot more coverage for a lower price if you do it in terms of the numbers of people. But the trade-off for that is most often the carriers will require that they control the breach response. So they draft the notification letter. They do the analysis. They, kind of soup to nuts. It's theirs. They'll do it for you. That's fine. It's cheaper, but make sure you're comfortable with that. If you want to control your data breach, Make sure your policy, your data breach response, make sure your policy gives you that control. Expect to pay more, but it can be done. And the last one on the list here is exclusions and retroactive dates. Exclusions, you just have to read them. Sometimes there's exclusions that will make you scratch your head. A client gave me a policy a little bit ago that had a data breach policy that had an exclusion for security failures. I couldn't even wrap my head around how you could write a data breach policy that says we exclude claims arising from a security failure. Of course there was a security failure. We have a data breach. So read the exclusions. Make sure there's not some language that's going to be a problem down the road. Retroactive date, same thing. A retroactive date, it will say, we don't cover claims that arise from incidents or events that first started prior to X date. Sometimes you have malware on your system that will sit there for months, weeks, years, and you don't know about it. You don't learn about it until 3 policy periods later. You want these policies triggered by when you discover the event, and you don't want a retroactive date that says we don't cover anything that's 2 years old or 3 years old or that arose a couple years ago. So where does that leave us? I think, the thing to remember is ultimately this is a soft market. This is a highly negotiable market. There's this asymmetry of information between you and the insurance company. The insurers are not sure how to write these policies. They have trouble getting their heads around your IT infrastructure. It's really difficult for them to understand what your particular business's particular cyber risks are. You're in a position to exploit that asymmetry and maximize coverage, save premium dollars, as long as you read the policies. And don't let hubris get in the way, of reading the policies. Technology jargon can be difficult. It's constantly changing. If you don't understand what the cloud is or what an access point is, ask your IT people, ask your attorney, ask your kids. The point is, if you're asking those questions for the first time after you've had a loss, it's going to be, frankly, too late. So I have 2 more slides here that I'll kind of cruise through since I think we're short on time. Just 2 other types of coverages to keep in the back of your head. Coverage for network and system interruptions. This is becoming increasingly common. Things like DDoS attacks, things like malware viruses that are shutting down your system. Have coverage in place that's going to provide you the money needed to restore your system. And then funds transfer fraud. This is part of your property policy in the crime coverage part. If you don't know if you have funds transfer fraud coverage, it probably means you have $10,000 of funds transfer fraud coverage. If you keep more than $10,000 in any of your operational accounts, you need this coverage. We are getting this more than any other type of claim right now is funds transfer fraud. It can lead to years of litigation with the banks as to who bears the responsibility. You're out that money in the meantime. So this is just a critical thing to look at. If you don't understand the risk, talk to your lawyer, talk to somebody. But this, again, it's critical. So I will turn this over to Brian now.
Thanks. This is Brian Boswell from Apparatus. Hope you can hear me okay. So how do you build an IT system to protect against breaches? So a couple of things to think about here with that statement. So maybe things that come to mind are, so where do we start with this? And then my rebuttal back to that would be, what are we trying to protect? How many systems do we have? What is running on these systems? Do we have any specific compliance or regulatory obligations that we're trying to meet with the systems that we're running in our environment? Well, with all of that in mind, the specific areas that I want to touch on this today are your risk management process, the controls that are associated with that, defense in depth, and awareness. Both Nicks mentioned at 2 different points here of risk, right? That's a recurring theme here that we have with this because it's one of the most important things with being able to build an environment when you're trying to protect against data breaches. So we're going to go ahead and start here with risk management. So what is risk management? Whoop, hold on here 1 second. Looks like I was jumping the gun here and not able to move the slides ahead. All right, so what is risk management? So risk management, there's many definitions of what risk management could or couldn't be. So risk management, according to, I really like this definition from the Certified Information System Auditor Review Manual. Risk management is the process of identifying vulnerabilities and threats to the information resources used by an organization and achieving business objectives and deciding what countermeasures, if any, to take and reducing risk to an acceptable level based on the value of information resource to the organization. So some key points to zoom in there on are identifying vulnerabilities and threats, what are your business objectives, countermeasures, and reducing your risk. So as also mentioned previously, there's no magic formula here. A breach is inevitable at some point with everybody, and so what you want to do is basically try to reduce down risk to the lowest point possible to help mitigate and prevent that as best as you can with your risk management. So some of the components of a risk management program, and this kind of blurs into almost the risk assessment phase of this. So it's a cyclical process, right? It's not just something that you do once and then we're done with, we wipe our hands clean and walk away. This is something that you just need to keep. It's a recurring, periodic process that you're just going to need to continue to do throughout the phase of your organization being in existence, right? So the specific component that are tied to this are being able to identify, assess, there's the impact, mitigate, and then monitor. So if we go in and start to break down what some of those pieces are, so what are we trying to identify? Earlier I made the statement of, so what are we trying to protect? That is a big component here of what we're trying to do. What are the assets that we are trying to protect? Has your organization determined what assets are critical, have the most business impact? So for example, if you rely heavily on email, and if that goes down, you're out of business for the day, that would be something that you would maybe consider to be a critical asset. So that's one of the pieces that you need to be able to identify. One of the other components with this is vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are exploited by a threat source. They are a weakness in your information system or your internal controls, right? So vulnerability that everybody was aware of or probably heard about at some point in time. We're coming up to about a year anniversary here with Heartbleed, right? That was a vulnerability. Threats. So we need to be able to identify threats. This could be any event with the potential to adversely impact organization operations or your assets, right? Or your individuals via information system through an unauthorized access, destroying data, disclosing information. We have data leak issues, or even modifying information that shouldn't be modified. That whole confidentiality, integrity, availability triad that some of you may or may not be familiar with. And being able to come up with these lists that fall under that identity category, there's catalogs that you can use for this, right? So ISO 27005 or NIST 830, those have a catalog within their documentation that will help you start to generate and come up with what those threats and vulnerabilities may be that could be impactful to your organization. And so once you're able to identify all of your critical assets and your vulnerabilities and some of the potential threats that you may have, then you need to start to assess. You need to kind of take a step back and figure out what it is that we have, what platforms are we running, what software running, what versions are these all running as. Do we have any current compensating controls that will protect us in our current state? Or are we completely missing the boat here and then we have to go and do a complete overhaul to accommodate and get the appropriate pieces in place to help mitigate and lower our risk to the lowest threshold that we're able to accept, right? And then the next step with that is the impact. So what will be the impact? So through a risk assessment, you may have a quantitative view, which that looks from a financial viewpoint. So you start to deal with your single loss expectancy, annualized loss expectancy. You basically are trying to put a price tag. It goes back to the earlier conversations with insurance. You're trying to put a price tag on, if we lose this, how much, what is it going to cost or impact our business? Another way looking at the impact would be qualitative, which differs in the sense of we're not necessarily putting a financial value on our assets, but we're basically trying to assign a relative value based off of the business impact it may have to the company. So you may have various levels of that could be high, medium, or low, and it'll essentially kind of form into a matrix that will tie to the likelihood of an event happening, right? So the likelihood through all of the risk management and risk assessment phases is the probability that a threat would exploit the vulnerability to impact your business or to affect an asset, right? So Heartbleed, for example, the likelihood of someone gaining information from that was pretty high because it was basically a point-and-click scenario at one point where people were handing grips and you could just download whatever you wanted to do and start to point it where you ever wanted it to go to, and then you start acquiring information. So the likelihood is tying back in and move forward with basically determining what the overall impact will have within your environment. So that starts to get into the controls. So again, it goes back to during the assessment process, do I have the correct controls, whether they're technical controls, whether that's implemented through software or hardware, or do I have the appropriate policies and procedures, which is another form of control that you're laying on top of that then allows to help mitigate any type of these specific findings or threats that you identified during this whole identify and assess portion of that. So once you've been able to introduce and add in your controls for mitigation, now comes into the aspect of being able to monitor. So how is your organization planning on monitoring risk over time? So things change, right? So risk impacting changes to systems or platforms, you need to be able to identify that. There needs to be some form of traceability, whether or not you're using specific change management process or some other means of being able to track the changes that could negatively influence the risk of a system or a platform you're housing. And so then, the ongoing effectiveness of your risk response to any type of changes that are occurring in the environment. So again, it's a cyclical process. It's something that you need to make sure that you're doing on a periodic basis. Each organization may have their different threshold of, we need this yearly, we need this quarterly, we need this every 6 months. It's almost kind of a depends type scenario. So during the risk assessment, there's several different methodologies that can be used during this time, depending upon who's actually performing it, whether you're doing this in-house or whether you've actually handed this out to have another third party come in and look over your environment to determine what your risks are, right? So there's several different frameworks. Did 3 here, which there are definitely more than that. So ISO 27005 is heavily aligned with the bottom one listed there, the NIST SP 830. It's written from a high-level perspective when compared to some of the other frameworks. There's the Octavalero, which was created by Carnegie Mellon through its CERT program. That has 8 different steps and varying degrees of level of granularity that goes with that one. And then there's the NIST Special Publication 830. That has the title of the Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems. FISMA and HIPAA, for example, they'll refer to this framework in the NIST documentation with regards to risk assessments and analysis. And one of the things that I really like about the NIST document is it takes the remediation and mitigation aspects in the overall process, right? So not only is it going through and working through the identification of vulnerabilities, threats, and assets, and then you work through that assessment phase and the impact mitigation, and then you monitor. Well, that NIST kind of ties back in specifically into that whole mitigation and remediation components with the risk assessment framework. So I guess the question could be now is so which one am I supposed to be using? Do I need to be picking a third party that uses a specific framework, one or the other? It really kind of just depends. If you decide to go and take this on yourself, you may look at NIST SP 830 and not use the entire framework from it itself, but take pieces from it. You may have a combination of both the NIST SP 830 and the ISO 27005 as what works for your company. It really kind of depends on the level of depth and how far you want to go with your organization as to what makes sense. Steps in varying degrees of level of granularity that goes with that one. And then there's the NIST Special Publication 830. That has the title of the Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems. FISMA and HIPAA, for example, they'll refer to this framework in the NIST documentation with regards to risk assessments and analysis. And one of the things that I really like about the NIST document is it takes the remediation and mitigation aspects in the overall process, right? So not only is it going through and working through the identification of vulnerabilities, threats, and assets, and then you work through that assessment phase and the impact mitigation, and then you monitor. Well, that NIST kind of ties back in specifically into that whole mitigation and remediation components with the risk assessment framework. So I guess the question could be now is so which one am I supposed to be using? Do I need to be picking a third party that uses a specific framework, one or the other? It really kind of just depends. If you decide to go and take this on yourself, you may look at NIST SP 830 and not use the entire framework from it itself, but take pieces from it. You may have a combination of both the NIST SP 830 and the ISO 27005 as what works for your company. It really kind of depends on the level of depth and how far you want to go with your organization as to what makes sense with regards to the methodology or the framework that you may want to use internally, or if you go and hire a third party to come in and do that for you. So controls. So I alluded to earlier, controls kind of go back into that whole mini phase of introducing controls and making sure those are there and in place. So what is the goal of this step? And so during the risk assessment, you're going to look at existing controls. So this may be, well, to prevent somebody from trying to brute force a username and password combination, you may have a specific lockout mechanism put in place that's already in there before you even start your risk assessment process. There also could be controls that you need to add in because you don't have the appropriate components, parts, or pieces in here that's protecting your environment. So for example, you have a web application who you find out, well, it's vulnerable to a SQL injection that allows for somebody to come through and wipe out your entire database. Well, having a web application firewall sitting in front of that, being able to recognize or being able to provide a virtual patch in the sense of if a company or if that platform hasn't released a fix for that yet, you may be able to use a web application firewall, for example, to add in an additional countermeasure or control that's going to prevent that from occurring against your system. So the critical security controls, some of you may be familiar with that. It used to be called like the SAMS Top 20. That has a good overview. Even 20, it may seem kind of daunting. That has even if you're able to get through the first 5 of those, of being able to apply those to your environment where that makes sense, that would be fantastic, because as you start to work through that critical security controls, you're going to see that there is some overlap here of being able to inventory and identify what devices you have, what software you're using, your configurations. Do you have continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation processes in place? So that would be another good place to start. It kind of ties in with the risk assessment, and there's some alignment there, but not exactly. But I wanted to touch on that because of what great value that can bring with that. So real quick, I know we're short on time here, so defense in depth. So real quick, the principle of a defense in depth strategy. So what are we trying to do here with defense in depth? We're basically trying to create multiple layers to increase the security of our system as a whole to prevent attackers or folks from being able to get into our environment. So basically, when you're adding in all of those multiple layers, you're preventing, if one security mechanism fails, there may be another component there that's going to kind of take the reins and alert you to an issue that's happened, right? So for example, if somebody came through and had a custom payload that was delivered through email and one of your users inadvertently clicked on it, maybe your malware antivirus isn't going to detect that because of it being a custom payload, but maybe you have network intrusion components that would actually recognize that piece trying to phone home, and then that's going to alert you of an inevitable, indicator of a compromise and a potential further breach occurring from that. So how many layers do I need with this? Well, it kind of depends, right? So your risk assessment and your risk management process will help steer to determine how many layers or what controls seem appropriate or are appropriate for your specific environment moving forward. Real quick, awareness. So this is really important. I know we're out of time here, but awareness. So why is security awareness training important? So for one, as Nick mentioned earlier, it helps being prepared when an event happens. Nobody wants to be running around with their hair on fire. Well, that was when Heartbleed came out, right? It was such an impactful vulnerability. Did everybody know what version of OpenSSL they were running on their systems? Potentially not. So for one, it helps you be prepared, but also helps your associates establish an understanding of the importance and how to comply with the security policies that your organization may already have, or helps lay out the expectations of the folks being aware of any type of threats that could be emerging or coming towards your company, right? So everybody kind of plays a part here in the security realm. Folks being able to recognize a breach or being able to recognize a situation, having that situational awareness is going to allow them to be able to escalate that to the right folks and get that handed off to your incident response team to close the gaps as quickly as possible. Some of the training topics here, again, making sure your folks are going through your security policies and procedures, social engineering. What we've seen a lot now happen with folks are receiving phishing emails and expecting to download payroll ext files and wanting to see that level of information. So social engineering would be great. Knowing that your disaster recovery process works and all of your data is being backed up and you've actually walked through that process is another great thing. Regulatory compliance, obviously if you're under HIPAA or FSMA or any other the compliance pieces that you may need to be accommodating for, you definitely need to make sure that folks are aware and are trained up on, and then being able to stay ahead of emerging threats and vulnerabilities. It's great for folks to be able to know that. So some of these activities could be corporate-wide security awareness days, like Facebook has an entire month of security awareness, for example. Posting and sharing information through your corporate intranet sites. If there's spam going around, you may want to post that to bring that to folks' attention. There could be formal training, so if you have specific incident handlers on your staff that need better or need to keep up with the training and the emerging threats, there may be formal training. And then testing your own organization's incident response plan is another really, really great thing to be able to do because, as alluded to earlier, you need to be prepared. A breach is, if somebody wants into your environment bad enough, they're going to get in, and you would rather be prepared and have your checklist in hand and ready to go versus being woken up in the middle and all of a sudden not knowing, okay, what do I do first? So being able to run through, again, and test out your organization's incident response is going to be key and your effort of maintaining acceptable risk levels in your environment.
Thanks, Brian. At this time, we can open the floor up to any questions. If anyone wants to submit those on the side, or at this time you can unmute your line to speak a question out loud.
I think we had a couple of questions already submitted that we can address. One was associated with how do state agencies or federal agencies differ from private businesses in relation to data breach. And I have a quick comment on that, in that a government agency really isn't all that much different from a private business. There are statutes which are specifically created at a state level for you if you're a state agency in most states. For example, Indiana has one related to data breach notification. There are also requirements that you can have to implement certain cybersecurity safeguards created by statute as well. But federal and state agencies have the same problems that private businesses have. If you look at what happened with the U.S. Postal Service back at the end of 2014 with their data breach related to employee information and also some personal information of customers, if you go out on the internet and try to find their kind of breach notification, their public-facing fact on the matter, it looks very similar to what you see coming out of Anthem and other type of companies right now in the private sector. So state agencies and federal agencies are kind of treating data breaches the exact same as you see in the private sector, trying to maintain that consumer goodwill and getting a good face out in the public. And I go look at the U.S. Postal Service's FAQ on their recent data breach, and I think it looks very similar to what you've experienced in the private sector.
And you can see this concern manifested, and even for those of you that don't work in government, a lot of folks deal with the government. You can see this concern that state agencies have manifested in their agreements with third parties. If you're doing any kind of business with them, you'll see as a term of that contract that they're entitled to know everything that happens with respect to your network security and data security, because they know they can be on the hook. So.
And they want to know it immediately. Their time requirements are very short.
Yes, another question we had come up are what outside auditors have been sued for violating the AICPA audit standards for failing to assess breach risks?
Yeah, so I've not seen, auditor malpractice is a very aggressive plaintiff's bar. There's a lot of lawsuits filed in that vein, but I've not seen any associated with the generally accepted privacy principles. I've not seen any lawsuits arising out of there. I expect that that would be ripe for the type of lawsuit that we're familiar seeing out of the go against auditors, but I've not seen any specifically for privacy-related claims.
Were there any additional questions?
One corollary I'll just add really quick, since Nick brought up auditors, is in the insurance context, going back to this idea of procuring insurance. Some carriers will require an audit from a certified professional as part of the underwriting process. Some do not. Be very careful if you are agreeing to an audit, because 9 months down the road, when your employees are no longer following the practices and procedures that you represented to that auditor, you may end up with a policy exclusion that says, we don't provide coverage if you're not, complying with, X, Y, and Z, or if you're no longer kind of living up to the representations that were underlying the audit. So you're always better off avoiding the audit and the underwriting process if you can.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. First, I want to thank our speakers for presenting on all this great information we need to know about data breaches. Following the conclusion of this webinar, we will be sending out a recording of the presentation as well as the slide deck so that you can review that. Thank you for attending.